Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Timothy here with Jank Diver Gaming, and today we're making a number of small patches to our Peasant Cube. We've settled on saving larger updates for new set releases, as well as working in additional mid season updates between major set releases. Originally, we hadn't planned a mid season update to the Peasant Cube, but we just got a hold of Historic Anthology IV, and with it, we've got a couple new toys we're excited to try out. We're going to work in these quick patches whenever we acquire new cards that don't line up with our scheduled updates, but expect these to be fairly quick and concise. As always, we'll discuss all of the new cards coming in, as well as the cards we'll be parting ways with, and why we decided to cut them. Before we jump into the changes, remember to subscribe to this channel for more updates and content like this, and find links to our Discord community in the description below. Alright, let's look at our patches for the Peasant Cube. Chris and I have talked about how excited we would be at the prospect of picking up Thraben Inspector at some point, and would you know it, Thraben Inspector's here, and we're finding room for it in both cubes. I remember everyone seeing this card when it was first spoiled in Shadows over Innistrad and quickly dismissing it, only to find out that the 1 mana investment gives you quite a bit of value. You get a small speed bump creature that can be sacrificed, it can attack, chump block, and so on, and the clue gives you your card back at some point during the game. It asks very little of you and gives you a lot more than you'd expect, so it's an obvious shoo-in. Kitesail Cleric got the axe here. The Flyers deck has been doing phenomenally better since our last big update, and it feels like losing a flyer or two won't hurt the deck. Kitesail Cleric is the worst of the one-drop flyers, with its kicker ability being next to irrelevant, so it felt like an easy cut. I've personally been playing a lot of Kaldheim Limited, and one aggro card that stood out to me is Code Spell Cleric. There are times that this creature lines up awkwardly with your draw, and it's a pretty miserable 1-1 Vigilance for 1, but when you pull the ability off, you do get 2-2 worth of stats for a single mana, and you get to put the counter on anything you want. Our 1 mana 2-1 white creatures are really what makes the white aggro decks tick, so it's a little sketchy to trim one of them, but Venerable Knight was the closest to vanilla out of the bunch, and when Codespell Cleric does its thing, it's going to be better than your generic Savannah Lions anyway. Codespell Cleric won't be better than Venerable Knight on exactly turn 1, but at any other point in the game, it should be better, and the +1/+1 counter even plays in Selesnya territory a bit. I think our peasant drafters are well aware at this point that I'm not a big fan of Tolarian Kraken. In all fairness, it's a decent top end creature for blue decks looking to make it to the late stages of a game, and it has a pretty good effect on the board once it sticks, but it just feels like there's not really a home for the creature. Blue green is really the only color pair that's looking to main deck it, and even then, it's in a much lower tier than the green creatures you could be ramping into for that color pair. I'm advocating for trying out Archipelagore in its place. It has a comparable effect when you mutate it in that you get a key attacker or blocker out of the way, and it's a fair bit larger as a 7/7 instead of a 4/6. I find Archipelagore to be a fair bit more proactive since the 7/7 body essentially has haste when you mutate it, whereas Tolarian Kraken usually plays defense on stalled out boards. We're not firmly in the camp that one or the other is better, but as a hater of the Kraken, I wanted to test this change out to see if Archipelagore can hold its own as a big blue finisher. Historic Anthology is offering Think Twice as a new blue cantrip for us to play with, and we're pretty happy to pick it up. Radical Idea was always fine, even though we trimmed it a while back, and Think Twice is slightly better than that as a simple piece of card advantage that can double trigger your spells matters cards and works well with Incidental Mill. We cut Strategic Planning, which is in fact one of those Incidental Mill pieces, but the effect of Strategic Planning isn't very powerful. I think players have Strategic Planning earmarked as a low-end playable due to how undesirable it tends to be in retail limited drafts, and while we think it's a bit better than that in the Peasant Cube environment, it was nonetheless a card that players rarely picked or main decked, even in the decks you'd think it would be good in. Think Twice covers much the same grounds while being a more universally desirable playable. Of note, black and green aren't receiving any updates with this patch, so we'll move straight into multicolor cards after a few red swaps. The first of which is Mask of Immolation, taking the place of Fearless Liberator. The Liberator wasn't a card we were dying to play in the first place, and even though it hasn't had much time to stew in the cube list, it's pretty obvious from Kaldheim Limited that the card is an underperformer. It's great when backed up by pump spells, which we don't have many of in the cube, and that's not even necessarily the case when played on turn 2. I would say it is a must block creature, but if you use a pump spell or removal spell to push it through, you likely don't have 3 extra mana sitting around to boast it, and if you're not boasting the creature, then what's the point? It was a placeholder to begin with, and I would have loved to test out Mask of Immolation in this environment. Mask feels like a good addition to the sacrifice deck since it gives red another way to turn creatures into extra damage, but it could play just fine in Boros decks as well as a way to push through the last couple points. There's another reason we're including this, which we'll get to in a couple minutes, but we expect the Mask to perform well in the list. As much as it saddens me to say, my boy Needletooth Raptor is another casualty of just not having a specific home in the Peasant Cube. While I'm quite fond of the Raptor and it plays defense extremely well, it's a lizard without a home here, and it's fallen dramatically since its inclusion in the original list. We've got some other 4-drop red creatures that could take its place, Battle Rattle Shaman being the one we settled on. It's a terrible defensive creature, but it makes your combat steps a decent amount better, either pumping up a big trampler for more damage or turning a small creature into an actual threat. It's not flashy by any means, but we've had our eye on removing Needletooth for a while now, and we're going to give Battle Rattle a shot to see how it performs. We've got a total of 3 changes to our multicolored sections, which are always hard areas to find room for new additions, but I'm excited about the prospect of playing with Cole the Forge Master. Just to be clear, we're not insinuating the existence of a full-on Boros equipment deck here, so don't expect a bunch of equipment payoffs floating around, but we did have a couple reasons for bringing the dwarf in. First off, Regal Leosaur, which we've always considered to be a decent finisher for Boros aggro decks, is just not drafted by our community and has fallen to the bottom 10 drafted cards in the list. Perhaps it's because Boros decks tend to have a bunch of humans which can't be mutated, or rather that there are ways to pump your board and people don't want to mess around with the mutate gimmick for that effect. Either way, it doesn't get drafted, and that frees us up for a new Boros card. The second reason to test Cole is its interaction with Mask of Immolation. These 2 cards produce a bit of a 1-2 punch combo where you can sacrifice creatures to the mask and reuse those creatures due to Cole's ability. Not to mention that Cole will just naturally pump in any tokens that happen to be equipped. It's a fun interaction that I'm excited to try out, and while we admit Cole might not be here for the long run, the Cole plus Mask of Immolation combo seems cool enough for the time being. Historic Anthology IV gave us a doozy of a peasant card with Hamza, Guardian of Erishin, which will replace Ironroot Warlord in the Selesnya section. Hamza might not be familiar to many players since it's a fairly new card printed in the recent Commander Legends set. It's 4 green-white, 6 mana total, for a 5/5 that costs 1 less to cast for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. While Hamza will often cost 4 or 5 mana, it's conceivable to cast this for just green-white given the way that Selesnya counters decks play out. On top of that, Hamza discounts your other creature spells by 1 mana for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Assuming you're actively getting counters on your creatures, Hamza makes it trivially easy to dump creatures on the board, all while providing a beefy body of its own. It slots into the list perfectly, and while we love us an Ironroot Warlord, Hamza plays more directly into the theme of green-white counters. The next card, Spider Spawning, has a pedigree to its name, and while we're not capable of reproducing Innistrad limited spider spawning loops, the card feels like a good boost to our Golgari section, which has been an underperforming color pair for a while now. We're removing Slimefoot once more, since he hints at a black-green tokens deck that just isn't really there. Spider Spawning seems like it also hints at a token deck, but it more directly plays around in the graveyard territory that green-black capitalizes on. If you've never played with Spider Spawning, you might wonder why we're so hyped about it, but trust me, Spider Spawning is a reason to fill your deck with creatures and self-mill, and the flashback makes it both a finisher as well as a value card if it happens to get milled over. We've got 4 swaps in our colorless section, which is awesome since the colorless section is still sporting cards that we're just not happy to be playing. Short Sword is another one of those bottom tier cards that never gets drafted, so we're upgrading it to Gold Vein Pick. We didn't really bat an eyelash at Goldvein Pick during Kaldheim spoiler season, but it's been an overperformer in limited for sure. It's actually a more expensive short sword as far as stat boost and equipment goes, but the treasure producing aspect of the card is more desirable for a wider variety of decks, and most decks with cheap or evasive creatures looking to pick up some extra mana can make use of it. Perhaps the biggest winner for our colorless section, and from Historic Anthology IV as a whole, is Bone Splitter. It's as cheap as you can ask for on all fronts, and the +2 power at the front end means that any creature attacking with a Bone Splitter is coming through for real damage. Bone Splitter is going to do what we thought Short Sword would do when we originally included it, and it's going to do that well. If you're looking to be an aggressive deck, that will be one of your best cards, as it pushes your early game creatures through once your opponents start sticking their mid game threats. No one will miss Raider's Carve, and I'm fairly sure no one even knew it was here, so we can quietly cut it to make room for this powerhouse equipment. Cold Steel Heart was the other big colorless pickup from Historic Anthology IV as far as our peasant list is concerned. We can ignore that this is a snow artifact, which was likely the reason it was included, and just play it as another piece of colorless ramp and fixin', which the Peasant Cube is very happy to grab. To be fair, it's not exceptional at this role since it comes in tapped and it forces you to commit to one color when it enters the battlefield, but that's probably for the best. We've been intentional in trying to avoid pushing 5-color good stuff decks in the Peasant Cube, and it doesn't feel like Cold Steel Heart is going to incentivize anyone to start doing that, all while giving us a good colorless piece of ramp for the decks that want it. Charging Ballista is out, having never been more than just a last pick draft card, and I'm not sure much more needs to be said about it. The final card for this patch will be Howling Golem coming in over Soul Guide Lantern. Golem was always a pet card of mine in Dominaria Limited, but admittedly it looks a little questionable on the Peasant list. That being said, this swap was made mostly to remove Soul Guide Lantern rather than include Howling Golem. See, Soul Guide Lantern was an intentional inclusion a while back to hone in the power of black at a time where black was dominant in the cube. We brought it in as a countermeasure to some of black's recursive elements, namely Phyrexian Reclamation, which we've since cut for being a bit too strong in the environment. Lantern still has a place as a graveyard and recursion hoser, but the thing is, those elements don't feel like they need a dedicated hoser at the moment. If we want players to actively draft Spider Spawn in decks or Kinetic Augur decks, we don't want them to feel punished by someone's random colorless hoser, so we're opting to cut it until the graveyard decks truly get out of hand, which doesn't seem like it's the case for the time being. That's going to do it for this patch update. We've only made 13 swaps, but there's a little bit of chaff coming out and some cool new cards coming in, so with the addition of a few Kaldheim cards and the new Historic Anthology cards, this patch should help tighten up a few weak spots while also giving us some new toys to tinker with until Strixhaven comes out. I hope everyone's been enjoying the cubes, and I hope these update videos have been insightful. You can always provide feedback in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. If you want to try out the cube yourself, you can find a link to our Discord community in the description below. That's all we've got for today, just 13 quick and easy changes, so thanks for joining. My name's Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and I'll see you all next time.